Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful session as part of the Festival of Treasury Transformation, where we have Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, joining us, former Group Treasurer. So straddling the world of both finance and religion, values, and we can reflect on that when we read his, or we can join him in reflecting on that when we read his some of his books, such as Dethroning Mammon is one that I would highly recommend for anyone who's interested in reading a little bit more about that. But you've got Justin's bio in front of you. You can see that he's been Archbishop since 2013. As I say, a former Group Treasurer in the oil industry and a loyal supporter of the ACT for many years now. He's actually our ethical advisor as well, so we really appreciate that, and we appreciate how Justin gets involved in our various events and things when time allows. So welcome very much to you, Justin. I see that you're in your office. You were telling us about your office a little earlier.
Yes, I am.
The audience, yeah?
Well, the office is in Lambeth Palace. It's the room I'm in is where Archbishop Cranmer in the 1540s wrote the prayer book. It was his office. In fact, he built this bit of the palace. And then there's a sort of drawing back curtain in the arches behind me, which goes into the 13th century chapel. So it has quite a lot of history here, and it's a good place to work.
And we were reflecting a little bit about your other successes. How many of your predecessors? How many were murdered?
5 to date. Our second son looked through and said, you know, if you average it out, Dad, you realise we're 165 years overdue for the 6th. so the and again, the press like to maybe have a little go at you on occasion. Nothing compared with execution, I guess, or burning, or whatever else has happened to your predecessors. But maybe you'd like to reflect a little bit. I think there was a recent piece in the Telegraph that was commenting on. No, it was a piece by Nick Timothy, I think, which said something like that the Archbishop of Canterbury is Nick Timothy, for those who don't know, was one of Theresa May's main advisors and chief of staff or something. And he said the Archbishop of Canterbury is something like the greatest example of moral cowardice in leadership in the country today. So that makes you think. One resists the urge to say, "Oh, come on, tell me what you really think." And it's certainly in this job. My predecessor said once, "You have to have the hide of a rhinoceros and the endurance of a buffalo in order to hold the job." Or it may be the other way around. It's certainly you have to learn to deal with a fair amount of criticism and to know which bits to read, I think. And I suspect there'll be people out there on the conference who have to deal with really vitriolic comments on social media and so on. And I think it's really important that we listen to the bits that help us think and don't get too torn up by the trolling, which is very much part of our life today.
Absolutely. And you mentioned leadership. In terms of your own leadership, and in such an important role, what would you say have been the key challenges for you in the recent times with COVID-19 and other things happening, such as Black Lives Matter? What have been the challenges for you, and what do you feel are the right things to do as a leader?
I think there's the challenges come in a number of sections. The first thing is there is the short-term challenge of the survival of the institution, the functioning of it. When you find that everything that you've taken for granted in how you operate, down to the very act of physically meeting with people, has gone. I was traveling on average 10 days a month, possibly more, quite often more, usually to really quite complicated places. And suddenly I find myself in the same place for the thick end of 4 months now, and not being with the people, alongside them physically in areas of conflict and disease, or in other areas, but having to do everything like this virtually. So you have to change, as we all know. I think this is common to all of us. But short-term survival also requires some very quick analysis, and it can't be done by one person. I think anyone who thinks that in a crisis of this complexity and this profundity globally, that they have the answers and they know what to do, really has a serious case of megalomania. And therefore, the ability to find new ways of working collaboratively and collegially, and making sure that you subdue your ego sufficiently to listen carefully to people who may know better, is absolutely essential. So we set up a number of crisis management groups, 3 of them, one of which was basically scientific, 2 others of which were organizational. We met very frequently, initially every day, and I took my inspiration actually from looking at Churchill, one of my great historical heroes, how he managed the situation when he became Prime Minister in May 1940. And it was based on small groups meeting frequently with honesty and accountability. And I think those are the key things. Can people tell you you're wrong? Or are you going to get stroppy when they do? Can they say, no, that's not a good idea, we need to do this? And we had some pretty robust discussions. I think the key second thing in leadership is that you do not allow the critical to hide the chronic in medical terms. We're facing for not just the church, but society, the world is facing, not the world, but many of it, in many parts of the world, 4 basic crises. We've got COVID, we've got the economic effects of COVID, and they are drastic. I mean, more drastic than any of us have lived through, even 08-09. We've got the Black Lives Matter, the recognition of systemic injustice in many of our societies, many of our companies, many of our organizations, including our own. My own. And then for the United Kingdom, and I'm aware this conference goes well beyond that, but for the United Kingdom, we have the year end and the way in which Brexit is going to be sorted out, the transition to the post 12-month period after we left the European Union last 31st December. And those are 4 major things. They are all crises, but if you go back to the origin of the word crisis, it means a moment of decision, not a moment of disaster. So the question is, what do they reveal? Because crises peel back the wallpaper, which conceals the chronic. And as in COVID, chronic comorbidities like asthma or underlying illness are revealed much more severely by COVID. In society and in our organizations, chronic weakness, long-term weakness, which one ignores, is revealed by crisis. So I think the key thing then in leadership is to keep your eye on what is revealed as chronic and ensure that your crisis management is not going to make the chronic worse, but is actually going to address the chronic alongside the crisis. And this is one of the key things we're trying to do.
Thanks very much, Justin. Apologies, you may get a bit of noise in the background because no matter how we've tried to cage up my dog, she's escaped and none of the family are rescuing me from this So apologies to everyone. One of these things about living in a virtual world, but maybe I could just pop back to the virtual world. It is quite an equalizer, isn't it? Because, for instance, there isn't somebody sat at the head of a table. Everyone is on equal terms. It's not the others that are on the end of the line. So I just wonder if we could turn to that, and if you could maybe talk about your experience in that, but also an equalizer, but it also can be quite isolating, and how you felt as a leader, and how you dealt also with your team, your people, the people you're widely responsible for, in times when mental health is a real challenge.
I think it's a really profound question. I think that actually is one of the chronic issues we have to address. So how do we deal with each other? In all institutions, quite often we treat people as resources or as functions. You know, you go to the CFO, you go to the group treasurer, you go to your cash manager, you look at the risk manager, you talk to the risk manager. The cash manager is called, you know, Jane, and the risk manager is called Jack, and Jane has a husband who's shielding, or a partner who's shielding, and, you know, and is trying to manage home education for her 3 kids. And Jack is really worried about his mum, who's in a care home, who's got, you know, they're human beings. And I think one of the effects is that in this is, like your dog, we suddenly realize that people have a hinterland, that they exist beyond what we see. And for me, the importance of the Zoom meeting for coffee, the drink over Zoom, the phone call. Yesterday afternoon, Sunday is a working day in my life, and probably most of you too, for that matter. But Saturday, we had a very busy day with a huge meeting all day. I came out, opened up my WhatsApp, and there was a message from the wife of one of my oldest friends, a man in the Congo, that he died of COVID. And brilliant bishop, absolutely holding an area of conflict and disease and Ebola and militias, and a hero, someone I've admired and worked with for many, many years. Well, humanity has to be first priority. So yesterday afternoon, everything gets scrapped, and I spent the time on the phone to various people, including the widow, seeking to support and console as much as possible. Now, in extreme circumstances, most of us do that. But my experience of the last 3 months is that, and we're finding it across the whole of the Church of England, that the areas that are going really well are where the leaders are making verbal contact, are talking to people, having virtual meetings, not to do business, but just to say, how are you? How's things? How's the family? And someone commented to me at a meeting of bishops online a couple of weeks back. They said, you know, we've all rediscovered pastoral ministry. But I don't think pastoral ministry is only for clergy. Pastoral ministry is for leaders. Pastoral ministry is the inspiration. It's the oil that makes the wheels turn. It's what motivates people to go the extra distance, to do the extra work. And therefore, I'd say one of the key experiences has been to spend time with people despite the busyness that is not purely functional. I think the second thing, my own experience has been the stresses and strains of being isolated. I'm isolated in a particularly nice place, so it's less on me. But I've noticed that some people cope very well with it that I work with, and some really struggle. And I think we just need to be on the lookout for that. That treating of people as human beings of immense individual value, regardless of their performance, is something that increases the way in which the teams will come back together, improves it vastly when they come back
Absolutely. There's been, we hear from our treasurers and our banking relationships and everyone how people are getting to know each other well in these strange times, and that those connections that you wouldn't maybe have. Leaders are speaking more regularly with their teams, and there's more of a democracy to it almost, isn't there?
I think you're right, and it's so important. I'm fascinated you say that. I think is so important. Yeah, wonderful.
Absolutely. And in terms of your friend, do pass on our condolences. When I don't know whether we're going to come out or go to the next normal or whatever's going to happen, but at a certain point anyway, we'll be wanting to celebrate the lives of those who've been lost during this time. And it is very, very sad, particularly as people haven't been able to mourn in the same way as they would do. This morning we had a session on the neuroscience of uncertainty. And Kim Wiley, she pointed out that the brain, your brain is triggered by lack of inclusion in the same way as it would be by physical pain.
Yes.
So your brain treats you when you're feeling socially excluded. Your brain acts the same way as if you've been physically hurt. And it just struck me as she said that. I just thought of all the stories I've been hearing from friends and colleagues who are Black, how they have been feeling over the years, over the decades, how they have felt less worthy, less included, having to try and, in some cases, live a double life to fit in with the white norms. I just wondered what your perspective was on this, because through this time of transformation, there are some good things possibly coming out of the last few months, and maybe that greater attention to the kind of systemic racism that is present everywhere. Just wonder what your thoughts were on that. Do you think we're going to come out better with this? Are there things that you're looking at? Anything that you'd like to share?
Thank you. I have the great good fortune that the person who runs my own diocese, Canterbury Diocese in East Kent, day to day, is a very remarkable former chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons called Rose Hudson Wilkin, who is of Jamaican origin. She's been in post since last November. And I have learned so much from her. We've also, over the last 6-8 weeks, every week, we had 3 successive sessions run by a friend of mine who is from another church that leads a very large Black majority church, some tens of thousands in London. And he has brought together leaders from the Caribbean British and African British communities to discuss with white church leaders in this country what they felt. And it has been a huge learning experience. So the first thing I'd say is the importance of listening. You just hear things which make you cringe when you think of what you've done in the past. They will, what one of the people on one of the calls called the microaggression. You probably heard this morning. The microaggressions, which are often unconscious. And I just sat there thinking, oh my goodness, I've done, oh my goodness, I've done that. We've got to start by listening. Secondly, we've got to get to the point where we can speak truth to each other. The New Testament at one point, Paul writing to one group of Christians in the 1st century says, learn to speak the truth in love. And love in the Hebrew, in the Hebraic way of looking at it, in the Old Testament, the way he'd used the word, means active consideration for, active commitment to. It's not a wishy-washy emotion. It's doing things. And so speak the truth in love is to speak truth to each other in a way that does not diminish our sense that we're committed to each other. And I think that sums up what we've got to try and do as a society. Will we be better? I think the jury is completely out, or to change metaphors, we're halfway through a 5-set match and a 5-set tennis match, and it's unclear. It's a set all. Some things have gone much worse. Some things have gone much better. And it's unclear which way we're going to go. We've got to choose. I've been saying this quite a lot publicly. We have a choice before us. We've discovered the importance of we over I. We've rediscovered it. In the health service, we've discovered the importance of people who we overlook, the people on very low pay, the people doing jobs we didn't consider really terribly worthwhile. We've discovered that we depend on them absolutely, totally for our daily life when times get tough. The question is, will we make a collective decision as institutions, and companies are among the most important institutions in the world, and treasurers are leaders. What will you actually do? What will I do that will make a difference? Discussing with some Black church leaders, they said, whatever you do, don't start another commission. Commission is a toxic word. We want action. And so we've set up not a commission, but something that will report every few months, or we're setting up, that will report to us by December, and then again regularly. And we will publish the reports. And it'll have independent leadership. We're working on that this week, setting it up. So if we mess up and don't do what we promised we'll do, it'll be public. How do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we make those changes that un-isolate people of global majority status, UK minority ethnic? How do we un-isolate? How do we set things on a better course and deal with the lack of inclusion with people with disabilities and many other groups, still women? Look at FTSE 100 boards. Church of England's improving. Since 2014, 50% of our bishops appointed have been women. Before that, it was 0%. So we've still got quite a way to go. But we have a choice. I don't know which choice we're going to make. It will only be a choice that's influenced strongly by people at the kind of level who are on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as you were speaking, it came to mind, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. And if I can just give a little plug, one of my team recommended a book to me, Slay in Your Lane. And it's a fascinating read, looking at the statistics around Black women and their situation. Is absolutely fascinating. So I'd really recommend that to anyone to have a read of.
I will look for that.
And we got some questions starting to come in, so I'm going to move to them in a moment. But just first of all, I wanted to ask you, if you were still a treasurer, how would you, the treasurer is at the centre of all this change at the moment. If we look back to the COVID-19 situation specifically, liquidity is the key concern of any business, of course. And that's how jobs will be saved, etc., etc. And the governments of various countries are doing lots of great things to try and help support businesses. But the treasurer is really at the focus, because they are the person in the organisation that is managing the cash. And I'm stating the obvious, of course. But if you were group treasurer again, how would you feel now? Would you be excited by the challenge? Would you be feeling very anxious and worried? Would you be feeling stressed or something else? I'm just curious, how do you think you would have responded if you can put yourself back in time a little?
I love the adrenaline of crises. Now, this has gone on a long time. The challenge, and I think for me, one of the great enjoyments of Treasury was you could make decisions and you were in a place to make a change. I think first of all, cash is always king or queen, whatever. Cash is in charge. Lose the cash, you lose the company. That's straightforward. Having said that, I think this crisis is different to, say, '08, not merely in its severity, but in its psychology. I'm really interested that you had someone in this morning. I would want to make sure, in terms of technical expertise, maintain the liquidity, yes. Challenge decisions. I'm trying to do it here. What Kennedy called a red group, President Kennedy called a red group, people who are there to challenge the strategies you're setting. Make sure you've got them. People who trust, they're not, but to avoid the yes person syndrome. One of the things we're seeing in leadership is people hug things close to themselves and they don't accept challenge. And it's really difficult. Thirdly, risk horizons. Are you keeping an eye on the long term? Because you can often manage short-term risks with some swift work on the course you're setting, some clever work. The long term build up, and in the end, they will get you. Thirdly, attitudes. I think the ethics. I hope I would go back to saying, how are we dealing? What are we doing that's right? What are we doing that's questionable? The old techniques: delay your creditors, accelerate your debtors. Is that right if it's going to put the debtor underwater? Have you got a culture within the organization that is reflective practice rather than blame? Can you forgive error, provided someone will learn from it? Can you forgive collective error? Are you holding on to integrity and transparency? I was questioned at length by our General Synod on Saturday. I probably got a lot of the answers wrong. One I got right was someone asked me a question and said, yes, I made a mistake. That was the wrong thing to do at the time. You're quite right to raise it. Now, I know they look slightly surprised, but that was the right thing to say at the time, because I knew I got it wrong, and it was better, be honest. So I would say liquidity always. I was obsessive about that. Challenge, attitudes. Do you accept challenge? Do you encourage reflective practice? Are you keeping to transparency and integrity? Are you maintaining your horizons of risk, long-term, medium-term, short-term? And how would I be doing it? Crisis generates adrenaline. The consequences of crisis generate stress. We're getting into consequence time. Be kind to yourself, take your breaks, get your time off, balance life and work, get your holidays, make sure your staff take their holidays. If people are too long at the office, working, if you're getting emails at 11 at night, ask why.
Absolutely. I think we have moved very much from that initial crisis mode into a kind of dip, and really need to look after ourselves. And we're encouraging our treasurers, sharing lots of materials on well-being and thinking about how to address that. But the great thing is talking to treasurers on the liquidity side, as you say, people are looking, short-term and long-term. But in this kind of mixed model we now have, with some things opening up, some things not really sure where we're going, it's even more difficult than it was at the onset of the crisis to be able to cash flow forecast in any kind of accurate sense. So I know people are working really hard at that, but every conversation I have, I think it's reassuring. In our Treasury world, people are talking about their people. There is a real focus on people and on ethics and integrity. So I feel very pleased to be part of this Treasury ecosystem, if you like, because really I think that they are focusing on that, and it's great to hear you encouraging those kinds of behaviours, Justin. I have got several questions coming in now, so we'll dip around a little bit if we may. So one person has asked, and there's a few likes here, what surprised you most about the pandemic, the good and the bad?
Oh, that's a really good question. Thank you. The good, I think, is fairly common to all of us. I was surprised and delighted by the way that almost everyone rose to the challenge. Extraordinary rediscovery of society, of the collective. I've had the great privilege, it's been the best part of the last 4 months, that we have a major hospital just across the road, and I was able to offer myself as an assistant chaplain there and go in there and do some chaplaincy work. And so I've seen the NHS at the front line on the COVID ICU wards. The chaplain has been very amusing, introducing me to everyone, saying, "This is the Archbishop of Canterbury, I'm his line manager." And that's caused much amusement. But you saw the collective. So it's the rediscovery of we. And that has been a surprise and an absolute delight. What seems to have been bad, I think, is the lack of understanding of the difficulties faced by some of, I'm not grumbling about the way I'm treated, but the way that some of our political leaders, our scientific leaders are treated. We treat them, President Obama last week talking about cancel culture, said, it's no use pretending people are perfect. The thing we all know is that, and it's a cliche, is that this situation for Treasury, for every area, is unprecedented. A pandemic with the worst economic crisis in 100 years, in peacetime, possibly a lot longer than that. Nobody's trained for that. Everybody gets it wrong. Hindsight is wonderful, but very deceitful. And I think the rediscovery of the virtues of forgiveness and understanding the complexity of other people's world has not always been as good as it could have been.
Oh, thank you very much. Funnily enough, there's a question that you may have, well, you have partially answered, I think, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You may want to add something. So this person has said, as a leader, how do you know you're always doing the right thing?
Oh, I know I'm not. Thank you. I really, really know I'm not. I'm quite certain I'm not. When I look back, I'm always vaguely surprised when something was right. But for those of you who've ever read A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, which now being on grandchildren, I'm on my 3rd time through, you'll remember there's a character in there called Eeyore, who is always expecting the worst, and there's Tigger, who's always bouncing around appallingly. I'm an Eeyore rather than a Tigger. So I'm always conscious of my mistakes. What I struggle to listen to is people saying I've done the right thing. But I think I work with the most wonderful colleagues, both here at Lambeth, my immediate colleagues, the other bishops and leaders in the Church of England and globally. And where I've made a mistake, they're happy to say so, but they're also very happy to tell me when I've done well.
Now, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? A human trait for many of us, not wanting to accept that we've done something good. And we really do need to.
So many of us suffer from imposter syndrome. I'll ask the people listening, when you've made a decision, I mean, if you're involved in the FX of the foreign exchange markets or money markets, bond markets, if you think back, do you remember your great decisions or the ones you got wrong? Most people remember the one they got wrong rather than the 10 they got right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So something for everyone to think about and really focus on. Because it is so important. And it's a funny thing with the mind, how you tell yourself something, your mind tells you something. And the more it reinforces, the more you believe that. So do you want to believe that you're rubbish and everything you done has been a mistake, or do you actually want to believe that you might have done a few things right? I think it will help us all, the latter. But I'll just move on to another question, if I may, Justin, now. This one says, how do we ensure that the world we go back to is kinder and more environmentally friendlier than it was before? What do we do as leaders and as individuals?
I think it's something we're wrestling with. And the big struggle is to make sure that we keep doing the things that are going to make a really big difference in the long term. So we keep on with the agendas of well-being and inclusion, despite the fact it will often be cheaper not to. We keep on with the environmental and green agenda. And particularly as finance professionals, we say it is worth it, because the discounted present value of the elimination of a livable climate in 100 years is far more than we can afford. There is no such thing as a discount rate high enough to eliminate that risk. The net present value of extinction is extinction. And we hold people to that long-term horizon, and we hold ourselves to it. And therefore, in terms of, I remember years ago when I started this job, a very senior politician said to me, either your priorities manage your diary or your diary manages your priorities. Now that sounds banal until you think, look at your diary, how much of it is around long-term issues that are around the kind of thing you've mentioned, and how much is just managing the day-to-day. You've got to manage the day-to-day. I'm not pretending you haven't, but have you got in there the moments when you're saying, what is the long-term? Where are we going? Who's doing the scenario planning? How are we making sure that our ultimate destination is the right one?
It's a really fascinating question, that one, and I struggle with it myself, trying to think how you do that, because the only solution I seem to have found so far is to work that bit harder and push through the longer term. And then as things work, you can then settle down into a more regular pattern, because unfortunately, if you just do the firefighting in the short term all the time, you never get to the other stuff, or even the day-to-day, as you say. Questions, do keep them coming in. The next one, though, is a bigger picture one for you, Justin. So through this, the whole theme of this week is transformation, and we believe things are accelerated at the moment in so many areas. So we've just talked about environment, we've talked about a few other areas as well. I believe possibly mental well-being is also going to be looked at in a different way, because they're saying that a third of the UK population, I'm sure it's similar in other countries, is suffering now from mental health issues. So perhaps there are some good things out of COVID-19, you know, that greater awareness, and certainly one good thing is you're traveling less, so we got to get you here today. But joking aside, what are the bigger transformational things? What are the things that you see that are accelerating, and where do you think society might be different in the future? And I know you said it might be like a tennis match at the moment, halfway through, but are there things that you see that will be transforming and maybe staying for good?
I think there is a very, from around our contacts around the world, there is a very, very rapid acceleration in environmental degradation. We're hearing that from church members all over the world in vulnerable areas, particularly the South Pacific. And they're seeing the signs of it. And that acceleration is a really serious threat. I think there is also a very, very rapid acceleration in non-accountable technology. The development of artificial intelligence is something of potential huge benefit, but also, as we know, potential huge danger. A recent meeting I was at with very senior military figures talking about the artificial intelligence on the battlefield. As we know, markets used to work, well, certainly when I started in the 70s, everyone made mistakes, and it was understood that in the London market, the money market, cash market, that you could make a mistake, and if you did, on the whole, you split the difference because the other person would make a mistake as well. Automated trading takes out that element of the human. It also takes out the element of the mistake. So you can see it's an arguable point. An automated tank or an automated robotic soldier it is impossible to conceive in the present world how that soldier can decide to spare the wounded enemy. In an automated business environment, do we have the sense of the human? That sense, how do we transform our world technologically without abandoning or without transforming in the opposite direction for the worse, our world ethically and morally? I think that's something we're all going to face, and in the money markets, it's incredibly important. A drop in the copper price, a drop in the oil price is of huge advantage to some communities and devastates others that are dependent on it to feed their families from day to day. And yet it's probably being done by some automated trading. So that's one thing. And I think what is needed, the biggest transformation, is the transformation of the human heart in terms of the sense of mercy and community. And we have not discovered a way to that within. As a Christian leader, I believe that that is the power of God in our lives. But I recognize that I'm in a minority in our own society, and we do need to recognize not just the dangers, but the potentials and opportunities for using the rapid transformation ecologically and technologically for human mercy and kindness, and not just for advantage. We're aware the United States has bought up 90% of one of the key drugs for reducing the impact of COVID. It's cornered the market, and it will all be used there. I understand the decision. Do you make the decision for your own citizens or for others? You've got an election coming up. I understand it, but I don't agree with it.
Yeah, sobering thought. And my own philosophy has always been a little bit, what goes round comes round. And if you think of the bigger picture, it'll all work out somehow or other. But that's maybe personal to me, my faith. And it's very pertinent we've moved on to faith, actually, because the next question that somebody sent in is a really good question, actually. Have world religions been working more closely and collaboratively together since the beginning of COVID? And if so, is this likely to continue?
Well, I'm getting tiggerish, which is very worrying. Yes and yes. First of all, the evidence is we've been working very, very much more closely together. In this country, there's been a faith leaders working task group which the government set up, and we've worked hand in glove across all the faiths, major faiths in this country. Internationally, last week I had a very long conversation on Zoom with one of the major world Muslim leaders, and we're continuing work we've been doing for some years on training young people in joint reconciliation work in places of conflict and civil disorder. And so we're putting down the foundations for long-term development of these relationships. And we do it on the basis that we acknowledge that we disagree profoundly, but we acknowledge that we hold each other, we hold each other's common human value as supreme. And therefore we will work together, however difficult it will be. And we're continuing to do that in many, many places around the world.
Well, that's good to hear. Now, do keep the questions coming in. But the next one I'd like to ask you just a quite a personal question, I suppose. At the outset of the lockdown, so the initial stages of the lockdown, what was the thing you found you missed the most? Or what were the things you found you missed? Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it.
Oh, they go from the very banal to the quite profound. The very banal was, I live in London during the week, and typically will go down, if I'm not traveling, which I am half the time, but either in England or overseas. But we would go down on Friday evening to Canterbury, and there's a wonderful fish and chip shop round the corner, and we'd arrive about 7 o'clock, quite tired at the end of the week, and I would go out and get some fish and chips, and we'd sit and watch a silly film. And we haven't been able to get down to Canterbury, and the fish and chip shop's been closed, and it just, there's been a moment of humanity and just total relaxation that I suspect we've all missed, that kind of thing. I've missed seeing family and friends and grandchildren. At a more profound level, I've missed the kind of travel which I don't do the whole time, but for instance, last October, I was in northeast Congo in visiting Ebola clinics in an area of severe militia activity, and being really with the people there. And that sense of connectedness, of being able to be there with them and share in some of their suffering and pain, is something I miss very profoundly. Yeah. And that sense of a reminder that there's no one who is not torn apart by the loss of a child or the loss of a partner, those sorts of things. I miss that.
Oh, and I'm sure they missed your presence too. On the brighter side, let's go to the Tigger side again. Are there things that you have been benefits, things that you thought, actually this is good, a lighter side to the whole pandemic?
Yeah, there's been all kinds of things. Again, the banal, well, it's not banal, but just having time with my wife and one of our children who lives with us. That's been just fabulous. But having time to ring up friends, because evening engagements have gone. Normally I'm out most evening, but evening engagements have gone by the board. So having time to ring friends and just chat, that's been a blessing. And then again, going to, I suppose, the more profound, to go into a ward and watch a young nurse or a physio just loving a patient whose life expectancy is questionable, is holding an iPad for them so that they could see but not talk to, because they're on oxygen, someone who loves them, and that they could see their mother, their brother, their partner, their whatever. That, and then seeing the same hospital in other wards, not COVID wards, still showing courage and, amidst fear, admitting to fear of going into the hospital because they see what it's like when people get ill, when colleagues have died, and yet going in and caring and loving. Those have been beautiful, beautiful, beautiful moments.
Yeah. The human soul is a phenomenal thing. We've got a few really great questions here, I think. Anyway, if I could go first of all, we hear about purpose as a key component of rebuilding our businesses. Can you share your own thoughts on purpose and how companies, treasurers, and individuals can use it as they think about the future?
In the Jewish Bible and the Christian Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, there's a verse in the old translation that says, without a vision, the people perish. In the modern translation, without a vision, the people throw off restraint. I don't think there's many of us who on our retirement day, or let alone on our deathbeds, would feel particularly satisfied, would feel that the heart of our lives had been that we called the cable right more times than we called it wrong. You know, or that we were particularly good at dealing in the bond market. It's a good, satisfying thing to do. Don't mistake me. I was very pleased when I got my decisions right. But I think that sense, Pope John Paul II defined a company as a group, a community of people united by a common purpose. And that purpose has to include an adequate return on equity or return on capital employed, because otherwise you go bust. It has to include discipline. It has to include organization. Those are all necessary. And they are absolutely, they're more than necessary, they're absolutely indispensable. We have to be hard-nosed, we have to have cash flow and all that. But that sense of purpose, what are we doing this for? In what way, at the end of what I've done, do I think I've left things, I've left people in a better place than I found them? How is that defined rather than so airy-fairy that it has no definition? I think that really matters. And so that sense of purpose, of human purpose, of community, of building people up, of training and developing people is extraordinary. I ran a cathedral for a while, some years back, 10 years back, Liverpool Cathedral, a huge, huge building. Most of its building was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And someone was asked, I was asked on a number of occasions, but I copied the answer. It wasn't my original answer. What was the purpose of spending all that money building this colossal cathedral, fifth biggest in the world, at the height of the Depression, with unemployment around in Liverpool at around 30%? And the person at the time said, the purpose is simple. We have given 200 people directly and several thousand people indirectly a purpose and a creative moment in life. If we'd given the money away, it would have gone in 10 minutes. And we've trained people, we've trained apprentices. And I'm saying we spend 200 million a year on our church buildings in this country. We have 7,000 listed buildings. In other words, buildings of historic importance. It's all raised by local communities. I'm saying when we do that now, let's make sure we always have apprentices, that we always have young people who are being trained through that. And we give the contract to people who have that sense of purpose for the next generation. So it's a really good question. In every company, there is the possibility of a soul-enhancing purpose.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And a lot of what you've covered leads really nicely, segues into this next question. Did you find the transition from Treasury to the clergy easy? And do you think corporate treasurers have skills which are highly transferable to life as an archbishop?
No, I found it incredibly difficult, particularly the 3 years of being a student again. I was a pain in the neck to my poor teachers. I was probably a pain in the neck to my chief executive as well, but that's a different story. I found it really, really difficult. Are the skills transferable? You bet they are. The organizational skills, the juggling skills. Can you keep several plates aloft at the same time. The relational skills. Can you build genuine relationships which enable honesty with your counterparties so that actually you can get things done, whether it's a deal of some kind or whatever you're doing, an acquisition, mergers, insurance, all the other areas, so that people will tell you the truth, so that when people say things to you, you can. The great N.M. Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, when he was asked how he'd been successful, he said, "I always left something behind." In other words, he never sought the absolute advantage. Mm-hmm. And that meant that people he built relationships. He was highly relational. Now, he made a lot of enemies as well, but he built a lot of relationships. So I think the skills, I use those skills, particularly crisis management skills. They're transferable with adaptation. I've changed hugely over the thick end of 30 years since it's 31 years since I left now. Mm-hmm. And only 7.5 since I was an archbishop. Even in these years, I've changed hugely. Realized my own fallibility more, realized my weaknesses more, realize the nature of the use of authority and power more, and become more cautious and more confident at the same time. So those are skills that are common to most professions. But yeah, it wasn't an easy transition, but there are skills you can certainly use. Treasury teaches you to juggle superbly. You go, someone says, what have we got to, your cash manager says, what are we going to do about X and Y? And someone else says, we're hoping to do this acquisition. Someone else says, liquidity in 8 months is a bit of a problem. We've got loans falling due, and how are we going to, you're keeping a lot of balls in the air.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, thinking back to the start of our conversation, you might have to watch your back a little bit, because we'll have these treasurers now all aiming for the archbishop job if you're not careful. So we've got 2 minutes before we close. I just wanted to turn over to you, Justin, just in case you had any final remarks, anything that you'd like to close on.
I think I would want to say, in these difficult times when everyone has failures, nurture your own relationships, your own, if you believe in God, your relationship with God, but your own eternal values, your relationships, which enable you to know your own value, independent of your objective success and failure. And that's the thing. I think that's a lifelong journey, but it's an essential one.
Very good. Well, thank you for those words, Justin, and thank you for being here with us today. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and thanks also to our audience for all those great questions that came. Really good questions. So the engagement's been great, even though it would have been nice to think we might do this in person at some point. But thank you again so much. Thank you everyone for attending this session, and those of you listening to the recording later, hope you enjoyed as much as I have. Thank you.